At 1:55 p.m., I stood backstage, adjusting the microphone pack that would broadcast my voice to the grant committee. $2.5 million for Alzheimer's research was on the line. I called my mother one last time. I didn't hear encouragement. I heard cheering. I heard the distinct, sharp pop of latex. "Alexis, make it quick," my mother hissed into the phone, breathless with excitement. "Garrett is about to pop the big one. It might be a boy." I stared at my notes. "Mom, I'm going on stage in 3 minutes. We can't talk now," she shouted. "He's holding the pin." The line went dead. I stared at the screen. My heart rate didn't spike. It flatlined. I walked onto the stage alone. "Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community." I walked off that stage 20 minutes later to a standing ovation. The committee chair shook my hand, his grip firm, his eyes bright with professional respect. I had just secured $2.5 million in funding. It was the pinnacle of my career, the moment I had spent 10 years working toward. I checked my phone. There was a single text from my mother. "It's a boy. Garrett is so happy." There was no question about how my presentation went. No acknowledgement of the date. Just a photo of blue confetti littering their manicured lawn. There were no tears. No shattered glass. Rage is a primitive limbic response, and I had evolved past it. I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me. It wasn't numbness. It was the feeling of a contract finally expiring. I walked out of the auditorium, past the reception where my colleagues were celebrating, and got into my car. I didn't drive home. I drove straight to the Fulton County Courthouse. I stood in line in my tailored suit, holding a ticket with the number 42 on it. The fluorescent lights hummed, indifferent and steady. When the clerk called me up, she looked tired. She asked if I was there for a marriage license. "No," I said, my voice flat. "I am here to correct a clerical error." I filled out the petition for a legal name change. I stripped away my father's last name, a name that carried the heavy, suffocating weight of Atlanta society and conditional love. I didn't want a name that linked me to a lineage of neglect. I chose gray. Neutral. Foundational. A color that exists between black and white, unnoticed until it covers the entire sky. It was a name I could build an empire on, one that owed nothing to anyone. I paid the filing fee with my personal credit card. I expedited the process. By the time I walked out, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. I drove back to my apartment for the last time. I packed exactly 2 suitcases. My diplomas. My research hard drives. My clothes. I left the furniture. I left the gifts they had given me over the years, the generic trinkets that proved they didn't know me at all. Then I went into the bathroom and locked the door. I took my birth certificate out of the fireproof box where I kept my important documents. I looked at their signatures one last time. Richard. Susan. They weren't parents. They were biological donors who had breached their contract. I struck a match. This wasn't an act of petty revenge. Revenge is hot. It requires passion and attachment. This was a funeral. I was holding a private service for the parents I wished I had, grieving the hope that they would ever change. I watched the flame eat the edges of the paper, curling the embossed seal into black ash. I was burying the daughter they refused to see so the woman I needed to be could survive. I dropped the burning paper into the porcelain sink and watched it turn to dust. I turned on the faucet and washed the ash down the drain. I left my key on the kitchen counter. I didn't leave a note. Notes are for people who expect to be read, and I knew my family only skimmed the surface of my existence. I walked out the door, got into my car, and drove toward the highway. The rearview mirror remained unchecked. Nostalgia is just a cognitive error, a trick of the memory. I was no longer Alexis, the disappointment. I was Dr. Gray. And Dr. Gray didn't have a family. As I drove west, watching the Atlanta skyline dissolve, I didn't feel the heavy, suffocating weight of guilt. I felt the cold, sharp relief of an audit finally balancing out. You see, my departure wasn't a sudden break. It was the inevitable conclusion of a 30-year mathematical impossibility. In the architecture of my family, my brother Garrett was the monument, and I was the scaffolding. Essential for construction, but meant to be taken down and hidden away once the structure was complete. Garrett was the golden child, a role he played with the confident mediocrity of a man who has never been allowed to fail. He was my parents' mirror. When they looked at him, they saw their own vanity reflected back in a way that felt like legacy. My father had poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into Garrett's serial entrepreneurship. There was the app that never launched, the crypto mining rig that overheated in the garage, the lifestyle brand that sold exactly 12 t-shirts. Each failure was reframed as a learning experience, a brave attempt by a visionary. My father wrote the checks with a smile, calling it seed capital. In contrast, my success was invisible because it offered them no social currency. A doctorate in neuroscience doesn't sparkle at a cocktail party. You can't show off a peer-reviewed paper on cognitive decline the way you can show off a son who looks good in a golf shirt. My achievements were boring. They were private. They required an attention span my parents simply didn't possess. I had earned full scholarships, worked night shifts in the lab to pay my own rent, and never asked for a dime. I thought my independence would earn their respect. Instead, it just made me easy to ignore. But the grant presentation was supposed to be different. This wasn't just another paper. This was the future of medicine. This was legitimacy on a global scale. I hadn't left their attendance to chance. I had treated their presence like a military operation. I sent 28 specific reminders. I sent calendar invites. I printed physical itineraries and mailed them to the house. I texted them weekly, then daily. 3 days ago, I had arranged a private car service to pick them up and drive them to the convention center, knowing that if I left it up to them, they would find an excuse. I paid for it in advance. But when I checked my email backstage, I saw the notification. The ride had been canceled, not by the driver, but by my mother. She had canceled the car to use the account credit for the balloon vendor. She traded my career-defining moment for an arch of blue latex. That was the variable that solved the equation. It wasn't that they couldn't come. It was that the gender reveal offered them an audience. It was a performance. My grant was work. To a narcissist, people are only valuable as long as they provide a stage. Garrett provided a stage. I provided reality. I realized then that I had been fighting a war for territory that didn't exist. I was trying to buy affection with competence, but they were only selling it for compliance. I had spent my life waiting for them to look at me and see a daughter. But they were only capable of seeing an employee who had stopped being useful. So, I fired myself. The road ahead was dark, lit only by my headlights, but for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I was going. I wasn't running away. I was relocating my assets. Denver welcomed me with a landscape that was the antithesis of Atlanta. Where the South was humid, claustrophobic, and green with kudzu that choked the life out of trees, Denver was stark, open, and dangerously thin. The air here required you to be stronger just to breathe. I liked that. I rented a loft in Lodo with exposed brick and steel beams, a fortress of solitude. I didn't hang pictures. I didn't buy throw pillows. I bought books, I bought lab equipment, and I bought silence. 3 months passed. 90 days of absolute radio silence. I worked 18-hour days setting up my new lab, fueled by espresso and the intoxicating freedom of not having to manage anyone's ego. But curiosity is a persistent scientist. It demands data. So, on a Tuesday night after a long shift at the clinic, I took my old iPhone out of the bottom drawer of my desk. It felt heavy, like a grenade with the pin pulled. I plugged it in and turned it on. It didn't just buzz, it convulsed. A backlog of 3 months of notifications flooded the screen, a digital hemorrhage of rage. I poured a glass of water and sat down to categorize the data. I wasn't looking for love. I was looking for confirmation. There were 47 missed calls from my mother, 32 from Isabella, 12 from Garrett, and hundreds of texts. I scrolled to the beginning, to the afternoon of the grant presentation. Isabella's messages were first. Where are you? We're cutting the cake. Everyone is asking why you aren't here. You're ruining the vibe, Alexis. Mom is freaking out. Then the shift. 2 days later, when they realized I wasn't just late, but gone. My mother didn't ask if I was hurt. She didn't ask if I was in an accident. She texted, "This is incredibly selfish. Mrs. Holloway asked about you at the club today, and I had to lie. Call me immediately." As the weeks went on, the narrative shifted from annoyance to aggression. They began to construct a story to explain my absence, one that protected their reputation while destroying mine. "We know you're having a breakdown," my mother wrote in month 2. "It's the only explanation. You're unstable. We're going to file a missing person report. Not because we don't know you're acting out, but because the neighbors are starting to talk and we need a paper trail to show we tried." I stared at the screen. They were threatening to involve the police, not to save me, but to save face. A missing person report would frame me as the troubled daughter, the one who snapped under pressure. It would validate their neglect by painting me as mentally incompetent. It was gaslighting on a legal scale. They weren't worried about my safety, they were worried about their public image. Garrett's texts were the most insultingly casual. "Yo, Lex. Mom's crying again. Just come back and apologize so we can go back to normal. Also, did you pay the Verizon bill before you dipped? My data is getting throttled." I felt a cold, hard laugh bubble up in my chest. It was the final variable in the equation. They didn't miss me. They missed the utility of me. They missed the scapegoat who absorbed their anxiety, the admin who paid their bills, the prop who made their family portraits look complete. Replying would be a tactical error. It would validate their jurisdiction. I selected Select All and hit Delete. I watched the messages vanish, erased as easily as they had erased my childhood achievements. Then I ejected the SIM card. I placed it on my granite countertop and snapped it in half. The plastic crunched, a satisfying, final sound. I tossed the phone back into the drawer and locked it. The missing person they were looking for didn't exist. She had died in a bathroom sink in Atlanta. The woman in Denver was someone they had never met and never would. 5 years is a lifetime when you're building an empire. In Denver, work became my oxygen. The city's thin air seemed to strip away the excess, leaving only what was essential. I poured myself into my work, and the work poured back into me. I founded the Gray Institute for Cognitive Decline. It started as a small clinic in a repurposed warehouse, but my research on early onset intervention drew attention. Not the flashy, balloon-popping kind of attention my family craved, but the quiet, substantial kind that comes from results. Major donors, desperate for answers, began to fund our trials. Within 3 years, we had expanded into a state-of-the-art facility overlooking the Rockies. I became Dr. A. Gray. The A stood for nothing, a deliberate void where Alexis used to be. My staff didn't know my history. They knew me as the woman who arrived first and left last, whose standards were exacting but fair. I cut my hair into a sharp, asymmetrical bob and dyed it a platinum blonde so icy it looked almost white. I traded my soft pastels for structured black and navy. I walked differently, with the confident stride of someone who answers to no one. One Tuesday morning, I was reviewing patient files in my office when my assistant, Sarah, knocked. "Dr. Gray? You have a moment?" "What is it, Sarah?" I didn't look up from the tablet. "There's an article in Forbes about failed tech startups in the Southeast. I thought you might find it interesting. One of the founders has the same last name as as the name on your old diploma." I looked up then. Sarah knew nothing, but she was observant. She placed the magazine on my desk. There, under the headline, "The Collapse of the Next Big Thing, How Atlanta's Tech Brothers Burned Through Millions," was a photo of Garrett. He looked older, puffy, and desperate. The article detailed how he had been sued by investors for fraud after misrepresenting the capabilities of his latest venture. The kicker? His primary investor was his father, Richard Vanderbilt. The lawsuit had drained the family fortune. I stared at the glossy page. I waited for the pang of sympathy, the urge to call, the old reflex to fix it. But there was nothing. No joy. No sadness. Just the clinical observation of a predictable outcome. "Interesting," I said, sliding the magazine back to her. "But unless it affects our grant funding, it's irrelevant. Please shred it." Sarah looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, Dr. Gray." As the shredder whirred in the outer office, I turned my chair to face the mountains. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. I had achieved the ultimate freedom. My family was no longer a wound. They were just strangers in a magazine I didn't read. I had built a fortress of success, so high that their failures couldn't reach me. I was untouchable, or so I thought. The twist arrived not with a bang, but with a referral fax. It came from a prestigious neurology clinic in Atlanta, marked urgent. I was in the middle of reviewing trial data for our Phase 3 study when Sarah placed it on my desk. "Dr. Gray," she said, her voice hesitant. "This referral, it's a high-profile case. They've exhausted all standard protocols. Their doctors say we're their last hope." I picked up the paper. The patient's name was Richard Vanderbilt. Age, 62. Diagnosis, early onset Alzheimer's, aggressive progression. I stared at the name. My father. The man who had funded Garrett's failures but couldn't be bothered to attend my grant presentation. The man who had erased me from his life because I was inconvenient. Now his own mind was erasing him. I read the file. It was a roadmap of cognitive disintegration. Memory loss, confusion, volatility. He was losing words, losing faces, losing the very identity he had spent a lifetime curating. The Atlanta doctors had been blunt. Standard treatments were failing. The only thing showing promise for a specific genetic marker was the Gray protocol, my protocol. The experimental treatment I had developed in the silence of my exile. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. The man who had forgotten his daughter's achievements was now losing his memory entirely. And the only person who could save him was the daughter he had tried to make invisible. They didn't know. The referral had come to the Gray Institute. They knew the reputation, not the person. They thought they were applying to a faceless medical entity, a miracle factory in the mountains. They had no idea that the signature required for admission belonged to the girl they had left behind. I could have rejected him. I could have cited a full roster, a conflict of interest, a dozen valid administrative reasons. I could have let nature take its course, letting him fade into the fog he had created. It would have been poetic justice. But I wasn't a poet. I was a doctor. And more than that, I was a scientist. I picked up my pen. Triumph implies a game. This was gravity. Fate wasn't just knocking, it was breaking down the door. I signed the admission papers. Approved for intake. Patient 402. I wasn't saving my father. I was accepting a subject. The Vanderbilt family arrived in Denver 2 weeks later. They didn't come with humility. They came with the frantic entitlement of people who believe money can solve biology. I watched them from the security feed in my office. My mother, Susan, looked older, her face tight with stress and Botox. Garrett trailed behind her, looking bored and scrolling on his phone, clearly dragged along against his will. Isabella was arguing with the receptionist, her hands gesturing wildly. And my father sat in a wheelchair, looking small and confused, staring at the modern art on the wall, as if trying to decipher a code. "I don't care about the wait list," Isabella shouted, her voice carrying through the monitor. "Do you know who we are? We flew here, from Atlanta. We need to see the director immediately." My receptionist, a calm woman named Elena who had dealt with worse, didn't flinch. "The director is in a meeting." As I explained, Dr. Gray reviews all urgent cases personally. You have an appointment for an intake assessment, not a private audience. "This is unacceptable," my mother snapped. "Tell Dr. Gray we are prepared to make a substantial donation to the Institute. We just want 5 minutes. I stood up, smoothing the front of my white coat. It was time. Mirrors were unnecessary. I knew exactly who was walking down that hall. I walked out of my office, down the long glass corridor, and into the waiting room. The click of my heels on the polished concrete was the only sound. "Is there a problem?" I asked, my voice projecting clearly across the room. The family turned. For a moment, there was silence. They saw the platinum blonde hair, the sharp suit, the doctor's coat. They saw a stranger. Then, slowly, recognition dawned in my mother's eyes. It started as confusion, then disbelief, then horror. "Alexis?" she whispered. Isabella dropped her purse. Garrett looked up from his phone, his jaw going slack. My father just blinked, looking from me to his wife, trying to understand why everyone had stopped moving. It's Dr. Gray, I corrected, my tone clinical. You asked to see the director. Here I am. You. My mother took a step forward, reaching out a trembling hand. You run this place? We thought you were missing. We filed a report. I wasn't missing, I said, stepping back to avoid her touch. I resigned. There's a difference. Alexis, please, Isabella stammered, her aggression replaced by shock. Dad is sick. Really sick. The doctors in Atlanta said this place was his only chance. We didn't know it was you. Of course you didn't, I said. You never asked what I did. You never asked about my research. You were too busy popping balloons. Garrett flinched. The memory of the gender reveal hung in the air, a ghost of their own making. We raised you, my mother cried, playing the card I knew was coming. We are your family. You can't turn us away. You have to help him. I looked at my father. He looked back at me with zero recognition. The man who had ignored my existence for 30 years now literally couldn't remember it. It was a cosmic joke, cruel and perfect. I am a doctor, I said, my voice devoid of warmth. I took an oath to help patients. I don't turn people away based on personal history. Relief flooded my mother's face. Oh, thank God. Alexis, I knew you. However, I cut her off. I am accepting Richard Vanderbilt into the trial as patient 402. He will receive the full protocol. He will get the best care my staff can provide. Thank you, Isabella sobbed. Thank you. But, I continued, I am not your daughter. I am his doctor. You will not have access to me personally. You will communicate with my staff. You will follow visiting hours. And you will not, under any circumstances, address me as anything other than Dr. Gray. If you violate these terms, he will be discharged. My mother stared at me, her eyes searching for a crack in the armor, for the little girl who used to beg for her attention. She found nothing but smooth, cold steel. You can't be serious, she whispered. We're here. We found you. Can't we just start over? Patient 402 has been admitted, I said, turning my back on them. Elena will handle the paperwork. I walked away. I kept walking. The sound of her sobbing faded, becoming nothing more than background noise, like the hum of a ventilation system. I had put them in the waiting room of my life, exactly where they had kept me for 30 years. The trial was a clinical triumph. Within 6 weeks, Richard Vanderbilt recovered his cognitive baseline. The fog cleared, and he remembered everything, including the daughter he had erased. But memory is a double-edged sword. He remembered, but he couldn't reach me. I made my rounds every morning at 7 a.m. I checked his vitals. I adjusted his dosage. I spoke to him with the polite, distant professionalism I reserved for donors. When he tried to call me Alexis, I corrected him. When he reached for my hand, I checked his 4-line instead. I saved the man, but I let the father die. My mother and siblings were forced to watch his recovery from the other side of the observation glass. They saw me, successful, brilliant, and utterly unreachable. They had spent 30 years keeping me on the outside of their lives. Now they were on the outside of mine, pressing their hands against the glass, realizing too late that the glass was bulletproof. They wanted me to be invisible. So I became a ghost. And the thing about ghosts is you can't touch them, even when you're begging. If you've ever had to become a ghost to survive your own family, share I chose me in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe.